And right now it's time to welcome our first guest, Roger Levy. He's the CEO of Cambridge Fiduciary Services. He's also co-author of the book, 401k, The Danger Within. Thanks for joining us today, Roger.
My pleasure.
You know, I know in your role right now as CEO of Cambridge Fiduciary Services that you provide services that are primarily aimed at reducing fiduciary risk for investment advisors, for large investment companies, and so on. I'd like to ask you first why you believe it's so important to act as a fiduciary in the financial services world.
Good question. So, in order to be a fiduciary, you have to be registered as an advisor under the Investment Advisors Act of 1940. And that is important because that act imposes on an advisor dual fiduciary duties of care and loyalty. So the duty of care requires an advisor to act in a client's best interests and to provide advice and monitoring on a continuing basis throughout the relationship, not just at the time of a transaction. On the other hand, a broker who is an alternative advisor on so-called advisor on investment matters is also required to exercise a duty of care when making a recommendation. But a broker's investment advice can only be incidental to a securities transaction, and a broker is precluded from providing continuing advice and monitoring otherwise.
And you know, Roger, that's an important thing because most people realize there's some people that work as a fiduciary, some who don't, but they don't realize, as you're saying, that in the brokerage world, you actually cannot work as a fiduciary by definition because essentially you can't give advice other than for the security as being recommended. But I want to just change gears briefly with you here in the minute and a quarter or so we have left in the segment. I want to ask you, is there a time in people's lives or a type of client or a demographic that really should look for fiduciary, an advisor who's a fiduciary, perhaps more than others?
Well, I would say that throughout one's investing life, you're better served by a fiduciary. But when you reach the point of retirement, or when you are in retirement, where your dependency on your investment income is of greater importance because you no longer have the benefit of earned income, your reliance on your investment advisor takes on a much greater proportion.
Sure. And that's a point where absolutely it's not just the initial transaction that needs to be monitored carefully, but it's all the subsequent follow-ups because, you know, hopefully people only retire once. And the one goal I know of all retirees is that, as a general rule, they don't want to become unretired because somebody stopped monitoring their investments. So, Roger, we need to take a quick commercial break. I'd like to have you back for another segment, please. And you stay with us too. We'll be back here with more on the income generation. I'm David Scranton. I'm with Roger Levy, and we'll be right back. And right now, let's welcome back Roger Levy. He's the CEO of Cambridge Fiduciary Services and also the co-author of the book, 401k, The Danger Within. So Roger, I want to start by asking you about the book. Why do you see, I know why I believe, and I agree with you, but I want to hear in your own words why you believe that there are hidden dangers within 401ks.
Okay. Well, in the time allowed, I'll try and synthesize that answer. So there are two key questions that a 401k plan participant must be able to get an answer to. One, am I being offered a menu of investment opportunities that is diversified and represents best-in-class investment opportunities? That's number one. Two, the question is, am I being charged only reasonable expenses? Now, the answers to that may seem simple, but in reality, the answers depend on the choices made by the employer when establishing the 401k plan and on whether the employer has been monitoring those decisions because circumstances change. Now that is critical because one, well, the answer is poor performing investments and excessive fees eat into retirement investment earnings. And in effect, if you're paying too much or you're not earning enough, that limits your ability to provide for a secure retirement income. And participants are not asking those questions. And the book is intended to encourage participants to learn enough to be able to ask questions when they're not satisfied that they're being well informed on these issues.
And then you also said that the investments within each category are diversified and best of class. So it's pretty straightforward to ask the benefits coordinator to get information on fees. And although those may or may not contain the embedded fees within each fund, they contain the 401k fees overall that wrap around the plan. But how about this best in class choice of funds issue?
Okay, so as plan sponsors act as fiduciaries. And as fiduciaries, they're supposed to perform adequate due diligence when selecting investment funds. And the fiduciary requirement is that you cannot select a fund for which there is a better alternative in terms of performance, risk, and expense. So employers have strong obligations to monitor the investments to make sure that the funds that they have in the plan meet with these directions, which are codified in Department of Labor regulation, I would have to emphasize.
So unfortunately, it means that the best-in-class fund choices, if you will, are only as good as the financial acumen, if you will, of the owner of the business. And I see that hand in hand even in my own practice working with business owners and 401ks. And we need to take another commercial break, Roger. We'll be right back. And you stay with us too. We'll be right back here in just a moment on the income generation. Now let's welcome back for one final segment, Roger Levy, CEO of Cambridge Fiduciary Services. Roger, thanks for sticking around.
My pleasure.
So there's one other thing that I see within 401ks that's a hidden danger that you didn't mention. And it's kind of like you said with the brokers. You know, brokers can only give you advice when it comes to a securities solicitation, but not so much about what best fits your situation. The challenge with the 401k, I find, is even greater, because the broker that oftentimes sold the 401k plan to the company really isn't allowed to make recommendations to the participants. And of course, the owner of the company has significant liability if he does. So where does the average employee go to determine if that allocation is right, which combination of these funds, if you will, assuming they're best of class, is right for his or her personal goals and objectives?
Well, you have asked a very good question, and I'm not sure that the way that ERISA, the statute that governs retirement plans, or Department of Labor regulation, fosters a good response. Here is what I'd say about the question you asked. An employer who establishes a 401k plan with a securities broker and relies on some limited advice provided by the broker is at extreme risk, because the employer is 100% on the hook for any decisions the employer makes about the investments, and the broker has no responsibility.
But are you saying that employer can kind of sort of allay some of that risk if they're working with a fiduciary and installing the plan?
Absolutely. So employers should be encouraged to get advice from advisors who are fiduciaries, that is, registered investment advisors under the 40 Act. And I'd go further to say that if they don't do that and continue to work with a broker and yet accept recommendations from the broker, they retain 100% of the fiduciary liability for the decisions. And further, I would say it is a fiduciary breach for a plan sponsor to rely on a broker. An employer should hire a fiduciary advisor. That's the main takeaway. So,
but that advisor still isn't going to tell each participant what the right allocation is. So in 30 seconds or less, how can your average participant then actually determine what the best allocation is for him or her? Hire their own fiduciary and have in the scope of services, if you will, that it includes helping advise on the allocation of the 401k?
Okay, a quick answer to your question. There are two potential answers. One, the plan has engaged a fiduciary advisor who has agreed to provide participants with participant-specific advice.
Good. And two?
The other alternative is that if the plan has target date funds, then the target date fund would be a good option.
Essentially doing the management for them. So without any pun intended, Roger that. I hear you loud and clear. Makes sense. Roger, thanks so much for being on the show today. We need to leave it there for now. We're out of time. And you stay with us. We'll be back here with more on the income generation. I'm David Scranton, and we'll be back in a moment.